You feel a headache coming on. You reach into a cabinet, swallow a small pill, and go back to your day. You don't think twice about it. But the real answer to how humans learned this trick in the first place is far stranger than anything in your medicine cabinet. Because long before pills, long before doctors, long before anyone could read or write, your ancestors were already doing something remarkable. They were treating themselves with plants. And nobody taught them how. Start with the obvious question. How do you learn that a plant can heal you when the only way to find out is to risk being poisoned by it? This is where it gets strange. Some of the earliest evidence doesn't come from humans at all. It comes from animals. The primatologist Michael Huffman spent decades studying chimpanzees in Tanzania, watching them do something that looked deliberate. Sick chimps would seek out specific bitter-tasting plants they normally ignored, and chew on the pith slowly, almost reluctantly. Huffman found that these plants contained compounds that killed intestinal parasites. The chimps weren't eating for taste. They were self-medicating. Researchers now call this behavior zoopharmacognosy, a long word that simply means animals using knowledge of nature to treat their own illness. So here's the twist. If chimpanzees can figure this out, then early humans likely could too. Watching sick animals avoid certain plants and seek out others may have been one of the very first pharmacology lessons your ancestors ever received. But watching only gets you so far. At some point, someone had to test it on themselves. Picture this. A person with a stomach ailment, desperate, tries chewing on a bitter root that animals seem to favor when they're sick. Maybe it does nothing. Maybe it makes things worse. But sometimes, it works. And when it works, something remarkable happens. That knowledge doesn't disappear. It gets remembered. It gets shared. It gets passed to the next person with the same symptoms. This is trial and error, playing out across thousands of years with human lives as the stakes. Here's where the evidence gets concrete. The archaeologist Karen Hardy led a study analyzing dental calculus, the hardened plaque preserved on ancient teeth from Neanderthal remains in Spain. Buried inside that calculus, she found microscopic traces of chamomile and yarrow, two plants with almost no nutritional value, but well known in later human history for their medicinal properties. Chamomile calms inflammation. Yarrow helps stop bleeding. Neither tastes particularly good. Hardy's research suggested these Neanderthals weren't eating them for dinner. They were eating them as medicine. Think about what that means. Even a species that eventually went extinct had already figured out that not everything you put in your body is about food. Some of it is about survival in a different way entirely. So how did humans start telling the difference between a plant that heals and a plant that kills? Slowly, painfully, and through an enormous amount of accumulated failure. Every culture on Earth developed its own deep botanical knowledge, refined generation after generation. The scientist Richard Evans Schultes, often called the father of modern ethnobotany, spent much of his career living among indigenous communities in the Amazon, documenting how their knowledge of plant medicine went far beyond anything Western science had cataloged. Schultes found that many of these communities could identify hundreds of distinct medicinal plants, each used for a specific ailment, each discovered through generations of careful observation passed down entirely by memory and word of mouth. There was no textbook. There was no controlled experiment in the way modern medicine understands it. There was only careful attention, repeated testing, and the willingness to remember what worked and discard what didn't. Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. A huge percentage of modern pharmaceuticals can trace their origins directly back to this ancient process. Aspirin was inspired by willow bark, used for pain relief for thousands of years before chemists ever isolated its active compound. Quinine, the first effective treatment for malaria, came from the bark of a South American tree that indigenous communities had been using for generations before European scientists ever heard of it. Even morphine has roots in a plant humans identified as powerful and dangerous long before anyone understood the chemistry behind it. Modern medicine likes to imagine itself as starting fresh in a laboratory, but so much of it began exactly the way your ancestors began, with trial, with risk, with careful observation passed from one generation to the next. So what does this mean for you, standing in front of your own medicine cabinet? That pill you swallow without thinking twice carries an invisible history far longer than the label on the bottle suggests. Somewhere behind it is a person, thousands of years ago, watching a sick animal chew on a bitter root. Somewhere behind it is another person testing that same root on themselves, uncertain if it would help or harm. Somewhere behind it is a chain of memory stretching back further than written history itself, refined slowly enough that eventually, someone could distill it down to a single dose you barely think about. You didn't invent trusting a small object to fix what's wrong with your body. You inherited it. From people who had no lab, no research paper, no guarantee of survival, and tested it anyway. You feel a headache coming on. You reach for a pill without a second thought. But long before pills existed, someone reached for a plant instead, not knowing if it would heal them or hurt them, and decided to find out anyway.